Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the subject of hate speech, or hate crime, I should say. Um, Particularly hate crime in this context. I've just watched a program called The Big Question here on YouTube, and I'll put a link below this video. And it is about the subject of is hate a crime? That's the title of the video and the subject nature. And it's specifically addressing the situation we have in the UK. So, to my international viewers, I suspect the legislation in your country may be somewhat different. Some countries are a lot stricter than others in terms of what is covered by criminal legislation. Certainly, in some theocratic states, there is very wide-reaching penalties for perceived insult to religion. In countries like Pakistan, for example, where blasphemy laws are very, very strong. Um, in the UK, hate crime tends to cover groups perceived to be a minority. Um, from what I gather, at the moment, it covers ethnic minorities, disability groups, and it also covers religious groups, which is a point of somewhat contention because people could choose their race, their gender orientation, sexual orientation, but religion, it is a choice. Sorry, I should have said people can't choose their race, their ethnicity, or their sexual orientation, but they can choose their religion. You know, you can convert to another religion if you reflect on it. Um, so it was a very interesting debate and a good cross section of opinions. I think there's valid opinions on both sides. There was a man who represents a charity, a pressure group for pushing for legislation to be tough on hate crime. Um, and I think most people agree that the differences between thoughts and actions. Evan Harris, who's a former Liberal Democrat MP and now is a representative of the Secular Society, had some interesting thoughts on it. Peter Hitchens, a columnist and brother of Christopher Hitchens, was there, and there was other people, and there was interesting viewpoints. So I wouldn't say anyone had any viewpoint that I would particularly disagree with. I found common sense in a lot of the arguments, and I'll put a link to the segment. It's not very long. It's about 21 minutes, so it's watchable. Um, for me, the fundamental issue here is between thought and action. So I want to speak a bit about just my own opinions on it because I'm not 100% sure what the legislation is. From what I gather, when it comes to perceived hate crimes, there is mandatory sentencing as opposed to more general crimes whereby it's discretionary. Sentencing is discretionary, but in terms of hate crimes, actually it is mandatory. That's the impression I got from this debate. But I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know all the ins and outs. Although one case was highlighted, that was a case of a woman called Fiona Pilkington. About 6 years ago, I can't remember the exact year, but about 6 years ago, she and her young daughter were killed by yobs in a housing estate in Leicestershire. And it was a very notorious case because she had repeatedly asked the police for help, repeatedly. This was, youth gangs had terrorized her. She was a vulnerable person. She was disabled, and eventually she took her own life because she could not handle the pressure anymore. This was sort of sporadic, um, well, no, I should say consistent antisocial behaviour leveled towards her. Now, I had an inkling of gang behaviour and it drove me crazy. I was 16 at the time. It was horrible, horrible experience, and I wouldn't consider myself a vulnerable person. So I can imagine the sheer terror that someone who would be vulnerable must go through. Um, and I do think there needs to be specifically tough penalties for that sort of crime. There was also a young man in the audience who said that um, he was a young South Asian man, presumably. His name was Mohammed, and he said that he was walking with his girlfriend in central Glasgow, and he was harassed by three men. They kept following him and his girlfriend. His girlfriend went into a shop. He was violently attacked. The police did pursue the culprits and caught them, but that's an example of what would be perceived to be a hate crime. because the way they were taunting the young man was based on on racism. It was based on his visible ethnicity. This also reminds me of an incident that's just happened in Australia. It's in the news at the moment. A young woman defended a Muslim couple who apparently were having a barrage of abuse from a loudmouth woman on the subway. I always say with these cases, I'm always a little bit wary of YouTube videos purporting to show something that's happened because they're always selective. They always only show part of it. But if it is a case that the woman, I mean, the media is being really sympathetic to the young woman who intervened, calling her a hero for tolerance and this sort of thing. I don't want to comment too much on that because I didn't see the whole video. I don't know what the context was. But not so long ago, I actually experienced someone in my local Tyne and Wear metro mouthing off about how she hated Pakistanis, and in the same breath trying to claim that she wasn't a racist. But she was being very specific about the group of people that she hated, and her and her friend were both stoned at the time. I could see because they had spliffs, and her friend was actually trying to reason with her, and they kind of dragged me into it, and I ended up. Usually in those situations, I take no. I just try to mind my own business. But I thought, okay, I'm going to try and get through to her and point out where she's wrong. Nothing really dramatic happened, but she was being very loud and very. There were definitely a few other passengers looking at her uncomfortably. So I've personally witnessed things like this. Now, would that be considered a hate crime? Well, in that particular context, not exactly, because there was no victim. There was no Pakistani there for her to direct her abuse at. But if there was, would it be a hate crime? Um, I take the view that, and Peter Hitchens mentioned this point, so did Evan Harris, and so did a number of other people. We need to be very, very wary as a society, that we do not get into a totalitarian situation where there are thought police. That would be very dangerous, and more often than not, I see tendencies for it to go down that path. Um, I'm not saying in legislation, but in terms of some of the general discourse. That is to say, when someone says something, for example, if a politician says something that would be perceived to be objectionable, sometimes he or she is shouted down and vilified as a racist or as this or that. UKIP at the moment is going through quite a lot of bad press for a wide range of reasons. But if we believe that freedom of expression is sacrosanct to our values, then we have to be consistent in that. We cannot just defend freedom of expression for opinions that we agree with and for opinions that we think are nice and cozy and comfortable and politically correct. We also have to defend freedom of expression for thoughts that could be considered unpleasant or bigoted. But the thing is, where is there a red line? Now, I would argue there's a red line with blatant incitement to violence. I'll take a scenario. Now, what that young woman on the train I mentioned recently, she was mouthing off that she hated Pakistanis, but she wasn't actually advocating violence against Pakistanis. She wasn't saying let's attack them. So the issue there would be, well, is that a freedom of speech issue? It's a difficult one because on one hand, she's clearly doing like a job. This isn't sort of something that she's thinking privately. She's gobbing off to the rest of the train, and no one wants to listen to her. But she's not actually advocating violence. Now, what I would say is if there was a Pakistani person there and she was abusing them, that could probably be covered as a hate crime. It's harassment. There's plenty of people I dislike, and I've been quite explicit in a lot of my videos about particular ideological groups I dislike. Now, I think most rational people could see that wouldn't be a hate crime, is what I'm attacking is ideology, as opposed to something that is beyond someone's control, such as race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Um, but I would still have a problem with any legislation that, for example, said if someone says they dislike gays, or they dislike black people, or they dislike um, disabled people, then that person should be arrested. I would have a problem with that. And maybe a notable example of this would be Katie Hopkins. She's a loudmouth columnist. She does a very good job of making herself generally despised. She's a pretty unpleasant individual. I've no time for her. But I personally can't stand her. Would I advocate her being arrested for her views? No, I wouldn't. Wouldn't agree with that. I think she should be challenged on her views, and I don't think she should be given airtime, but I don't think she should be arrested. Um, I would have a problem with that, because then we do get into a realm of thought police. It is true that there are people out there who provoke for the sake of it, but I think we need to differentiate between incitement to violence or acting on hatred, i.e., verbally harassing someone, as opposed to simply making a statement of dislike or hatred, because it is human nature. And I think most honest people, if they're being brutally 100% honest, would admit that there are at least some types of people they dislike. Um, that's this anger and hatred are human things. They're not pleasant things, but they are human. Now, I do think that there should be legislation against actions, um, generally speaking, for yobbish behaviour in general and harassing people in general. But I would agree with the man in the audience that said there is a need for legislation protecting people who would be seen as more vulnerable, because there is a disproportionate level of abuse against them. For example, hate crimes against disabled people have, and we're not talking about comments here, we're talking about actual physical abuse, have increased in recent years. That's worrying. And as a civilized society, we should absolutely be disgusted by that and not tolerate it. And there should be legislation to specifically attack people who could be seen as vulnerable. Now, there was a point in the debate that will that then elevates them before the law. And I can understand where that argument goes, but I think that we need a common sense approach to this. Freedom of speech, although sacrosanct, should not be used to cover incitement to violence or harassment. For example, if you notice, for example, someone is gay and you follow them around, you don't physically touch them, you don't hit them, you don't throw something at them, but you shout at them and you yell like, you're a dirty fag, etc., etc. Now, could that be considered a hate crime? I would say absolutely yes, because it causes anxiety, it causes fear, it causes mental anguish, it causes all sorts of things. And the same logic could be applied to any other person that is targeted because of something that is beyond their control. Um, a famous example would be Stephen Lawrence, a young black teenager killed in London. That's a well-publicised example, but works both ways. Chris Marshall was a young white man killed in Glasgow by an Asian gang. Now that should absolutely be considered a hate crime as well, because that South Asian gang had specifically looked for a white person to attack. So this has to be across the board. I do think there should be very tough penalties for people targeted solely because they are identified in a certain way. Now, in terms of religion, again, I think actions again are different from thoughts. I have always staunchly defended the right to criticize religion, and not just to criticize it, dislike and even hate it. If someone says they hate Islam, they think it's a violent, intolerant religion, I support their stance 100%, the right to have that stance. 100%. But if they were to go out and harass the next Muslim they saw, as was the case in Australia, that's different. So I think the fundamental aspect of all of this is the borderline between thoughts and opinions and incitement and actions. Because there is a clear dividing line. If someone makes a video and says they hate group A because of all these reasons and it's a pretty nasty rant, that's unpleasant and the person should be challenged on their views under ignorance. Should it be seen as a hate crime? I don't think it should. If, however, that person goes on and makes a video and says, Group A let's attack them. I'm organising this protest to violently attack that group. That should be considered a hate crime. Now, an interesting question was actually brought up in the debate. What if a paedophile is targeted by a lynch mob after being named by a paper? Should that paedophile be considered the victim of a hate crime? Because the paedophile is a minority. They're acting on an orientation. And yet most of society would think, well, they've committed a heinous crime. How can anyone sympathise with them? Um, my own position on that is I never have time for mob violence, whoever is the target. I do believe someone like a paedophile should be punished harshly, but I think mob violence degenerates us as a society. My final thoughts on this are just what I've said. There needs to be a dividing line between thoughts and actions. I do think we are in a dangerous area if people are being threatened with jail simply for having an opinion, even if it's an unpleasant opinion. I really don't think that they should be criminalized for that. Um, they should be challenged. So there should be counter opinions to challenge their stupidity and their ignorance. In fact, it's interesting we're talking about this. I'm talking about this because behind me is a picture of Speaker's Corner in London. Maybe you can see it's a famous part of London whereby you can pretty much say what you want. I think the only thing that is whereby there would be a police intervention is if there is an incitement to violence. But there's all sorts of colourful characters at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. If you ever get an opportunity, it's well worth checking out. Um, so yeah, that would be my final thoughts. Um, having the sanctity of thoughts is an absolute fundamental aspect of the sacrosanct nature of free expression and free thinking. And if we don't have that, we will end up totalitarian because the thought police will start to dictate. And then who gets to decide who dictates that? How people think. That is incredibly dangerous. But I do think that stirring up hatred against a group, inciting hatred against a group, um, that's a different matter. And I think that definitely actions, that's most reasonable people would see that as a clear dividing line. Um, Again, maybe this comes into the press as well. I'm sorry, I'll finish up soon, but I just want to mention this point. I absolutely despise some of the stuff the tabloid press comes out with because I do believe that's stirring up hatred against certain groups, especially unemployed people. Um, would I advocate banning that? I couldn't really say that because that couldn't be consistent with the idea of free expression. However, what I do think should be the case is I think there should be a lot more accountability of tabloid editors, and they should have to answer the public a lot more. I think at the present, they hide behind the free press and they can hide behind their editorial desk and basically get away with murder. I think that's unacceptable. I do think they should be so okay, let them have those sort of headlines, but then they should have to justify it a lot more. And I honestly believe we need a situation whereby they are put under the sort of pressure the politicians are. We have debates between leading politicians. Why not get all the leading editors of this country and have them answer questions as to why they report in a certain way? And this is not an attack on the free press. They'd still be able to do it. Rather, it's holding them accountable because they are in a position of power. So I really wouldn't, I really don't think that would be a bad idea. Okay, let me know your thoughts on this and I will put that segment below. Thank you.